The story introduces Lee Townsend, dressed up for a day at work. She finds the jar empty after trying to pour herself a get-to-go cup of coffee. With an eye roll, she grabs her bag and leaves the apartment. The Cinco Dublin show is on air, hosted by Cinco Dublin himself, and the topic of discussion is bikes versus cars. Lee goes to a familiar coffee stand that has the radio tuned in. The attendant, Sam, catches her eye roll and tries to vouch for Cinco's show, stating the guy is humorous and unbiased. Lee remarks she's just not a fan, but she can appreciate good coffee when she sees it. With a good coffee in hand, Lee takes an elevator ride to her publisher's office. The publisher goes through the manuscript and gives a positive remark about the protagonist. The hiccup, though, is that the publisher can't see a clear picture or direction of the story's plot. Lee finds herself engaged in a sort of therapy session with her publisher, as JR needs to know why Lee's second book lacks the energy the first book didn't. Lee's excuse is that the first book was a reflection of her life. The excuse won't fly, and the publisher gives Lee 4 weeks to fix her new manuscript, even offering her a booklet of ideas she and the marketing department were able to put together. Lee returns home and gets to work on her system. Her neighbor, Kate, who is up to speed on Lee's dilemma, comes to check up on her. Lee complains the current manuscript took her 6 months to put together, and it's quite aggravating to have to rewrite the whole thing in 4 weeks. In the midst of their conversation, Lee reveals it's Friday, date night for her and Edward, her boyfriend. Kate jokingly recites the routine activities Lee and Edward will have on their date. Lee tries to argue it, but Kate keeps her stance, calling Lee a people pleaser. Lee, exasperated, chases Kate out of her apartment so she can concentrate on her work. Before she leaves, Kate challenges her to try something new, and Lee breezily accepts the challenge. Edward and Lee go out on their date, and Edward notices Lee is a bit off after cracking an Adam-related joke she barely laughs at. She explains the issue with her manuscript, but Edward doesn't offer much of an input. She then finds herself asking him if he can relate with the feeling of stagnation. Before she can get a response, a waiter familiar with them approaches their table and greets them. Edward orders their usual, but Lee has her eyes on the crepe Suzette. She states it looks fun enough to try, but Edward is appalled she's interested in the spectacle of a dish. Seeing his expression makes her change her mind, even though Edward insists she's free to have whatever she wants. When she retires home, Kate is waiting for a download, and is disappointed to learn Lee activated people-pleaser mode. Kate tries to advise her against being such a doormat, but Lee deems her biggest problem is what to wear to Edward's reception. Kate remarks it doesn't matter, because Edward wouldn't notice enough to compliment. Lee agrees, wishing she'd spent the time browsing through outfits, working instead on her manuscript. Kate suggests drawing inspiration from real-life conflicts Lee must have had with Edward. Lee, however, reveals she and Edward don't have conflicts. They've been in a safe and comfortable relationship without conflicts for 2 years now. Kate concludes they're a boring couple. Bent on spicing up her neighbor's love life, Kate encourages Lee to go with a red, short dress, as she's sure Edward will notice that. Lee walks out to meet a waiting Edward, who wears an uncomfortable look on seeing her. Lee proposes she could change into something else, and Edward battles between keeping to time and telling her to indeed change outfits. The red, short dress will have to do. At the reception, Lee convinces Edward to leave her side and go interact with his friends. She sneaks outside to smell some flowers, and Cinco materializes from behind the array of bouquets. Being both public figures, she, a senator's daughter, and he, a radio show host, they are well aware of each other without much introduction. Lee's demeanor towards Cinco is ice-cold, because she has a grudge to hold. He reviewed her first book on air, and left a rather harsh critique she still remembers line for line. Cinco hands her his glass of wine and insists she throws it in his face, because he deserves it. She refuses, takes a sip instead, and hands him back his drink. He accepts the drink with a smirk and begins to silently walk away. Before he leaves, he compliments Lee for wearing the color red well. Cinco's gone by the time Edward finds her. Edward asks why she's outside and by herself, questioning if she's acting off because he doesn't like her dress. Realizing what he's just said, he tries to backtrack by stating she doesn't need fancy clothes. Soon after, Lee is typing away on her system when Edward comes in. He apologizes for the impromptu visit, but Lee expresses excitement over him doing something spontaneous. He gives her a bouquet of flowers, and attached is a card he encourages her to read while he's still there. The card reads Edward's goal to make them work as a couple, as he surely wants the same. Within the card is a coupon for a conflict management class. Edward reminds Lee the previous night was awkward, and she's been having issues with her writing, so the classes will help resolve that. Edward looks forward to smoothing their rough patches, and announces the first session is that night. Not much else Lee can do than to agree, as he already paid in full. Lee turns up for the class, and learns quickly Edward signed just her alone up for the classes. While she's still in denial, Cinco walks in, loudly apologizing for being late. He's there because he lost his cool with a guest on his show, and a court order demands he takes the classes. Lee tries to hide from him, but the class attendant calls out to her about her unfinished registration. With no way out, Lee faces her tormentor, who is surprised to see her there. The class begins with introductions. The attendant/instructor introduces herself as Marilyn Hawkins and passes the baton. It gets to Lee's turn, and she opines she has no conflicts or reasons to be in the sessions. Marilyn asks why Lee was earlier convinced Edward should be at the meeting, and Lee decides to introduce Edward as her second cousin, who just had kidney surgery and couldn't make it for the meeting. She emphasizes the class was all his idea. Cinco tries to poke holes in Lee's kidney story, while Marilyn is distracted over some payment issues with Ernie, one of the members. Marilyn enforces Ernie can't be part of the class if he doesn't have his receipt to clear up the payment issue. This makes Ernie passive-aggressive, first at Marilyn, and then at Glenda when she makes a sarcastic remark. Robert gets protective over his wife, and Cinco springs to his feet to stand as mediator against a possible fight between the two men. Marilyn reveals the thing with Ernie was a stunt instigator to visualize the various forms of conflicts. She identifies Cinco as a mediator, but warns jumping into conflict can sometimes be dangerous. Marilyn also identifies Lee as someone who avoids conflicts. Lee concurs, stating she likes a space where everyone gets along. After the class, Lee confronts Edward at his apartment about his absence. He clarifies the classes are for her, as he doesn't have a problem. He reminds her of his commitment to the relationship, and expects she'll put in the same energy. A puzzled Lee stutteringly reassures him she's just as invested. During the next class, Marilyn introduces an exercise called Address and Accept. The exercise will happen in pairs, and Cinco and Lee are asked to go first. Lee can't find anything to address, so Cinco happily takes the lead by stating she needs the class more than anyone else in the room. Lee replies Cinco doesn't know her to have made such a remark, but Marilyn points out Lee's response was directed as a report to her, rather than a direct statement to Cinco himself. Marilyn asks Lee to try again, and Lee decides she's had enough of the class in its entirety. Marilyn states the door is wide open, but it's best she doesn't leave while she still has a problem. This aggravates Lee, and she has an outburst of words which Marilyn points out should be directed at Cinco, not her. To the rest of the class, Marilyn explains Lee is experiencing misplaced anger. Lee returns back to her seat, and Cinco comments he appreciates her assessment of him. Lee observes his comment sounds sincere. Back home, Lee rants to Kate about the outcome of the classes. She insists she doesn't need to be there, hammering on her non-existent conflicts between her and Edward. The radio is tuned in, and Cinco is on air talking about his experience from the classes. He specifically brings up the Address and Accept exercise, and Kate realizes Cinco is talking on air about his experience with Lee during the exercise. After retelling the encounter, characterizing Lee as in denial, he leaves the floor open for callers to discuss the difficulties of people facing realities about themselves. Lee picks up the phone before she can think it through and dials the hotline, probably thinking she is riled enough to give Cinco a piece of her mind. Instead, she stutters, and Cinco has to coach her through telling the audience her name first. She gives a fake name and the words start flowing easily. Kate watches, mouth wide, as Lee tells Cinco it's possible the woman doesn't belong in the class because she actually doesn't have any conflict issues. He, on the other hand, is known to thrive on conflicts. Even more so because she believes he's attracted to her, but isn't ready to acknowledge the feeling in a mature and healthy way. Cinco asks why she feels he's attracted to the woman from his class, and Lee takes the cue to end the call. She takes little pride in knowing she must have made her point clear to Cinco, and hands the phone to Kate so she isn't tempted to call back. Lee goes to her parents' place for dinner, and her father expresses his gratitude that she came, because her mother had told him earlier she would be canceling. Lee's mom explains Lee still has her manuscript to work on, but Lee affirms she isn't one to cancel on family plans. Light conversation reveals Lee's dad has been tuned into the Cinco Dublin show. Lee, hearing this, almost chokes on a morsel of her meal. Senator Douglas opines Cinco a knucklehead just like his father, who has greatly criticized his political career in the newspapers. He calls them birds of the same feather, aimed at poisoning the public's minds. Senator Douglas seeks his daughter's opinion on the matter, and Lee timidly remarks whatever beef her father has is with Dublin Sr., not Jr. Senator Douglas asks defensively if they actually listened to Cinco's broadcast. The wife asserts they all did, and it was nothing to pick a fight over. Lee finds herself singled out by her father again for her opinion, and she feels cornered enough to pick his side, much to his satisfaction. Later on, Lee and her mother are out of earshot, with her mom adding finishing touches to the pancake desserts. This prompts Lee to ask her mom if she's ever tried crepe Suzette, and the mom admits she has, many times, but not with Lee's father. Lee inquires if her mom always does what her dad wants, and the mom replies they know what works best for them. Lee stutters about trying to spice things up with Edward and failing. Her mother informs her relationships are not meant to always be smooth. Lee rewrites the manuscript with a dash of conflict she's sure will work, but when she meets up with JR, she isn't impressed. The story is still lacking a big chunk of drama, and JR has to read the dictionary meaning of the word conflict to get Lee to understand what she needs her book character to be able to do. At least Lee is now open to the idea of trying another rewrite, even though JR reminds her she can't take too long. At her next session, Cinco announces he's reading and giving her book a second chance to redeem itself to him, much like he does with people. He's sprawled on the sofa with her book in hand when he announces this to an amused Lee. The members of the class are engaged in a conversation about what stems their conflicts. Ernie passes the baton to Lee, who reiterates she has no conflicts in her life. She bemuses it's so bad, she can't identify or write about it in her new book. Marilyn asks her about the father-daughter relationship in her first book, and Lee admits the character doesn't mirror her actual life. She's a daddy girl and goes out of her way not to disappoint him. Cinco, who had been listening intently, inputs her book was written passionately, but what he hears is Lee wanting to pander the second book to her publisher's taste. They get passive-aggressive with each other, and Cinco throws a jab about her being a doormat for her publisher and her father. Marilyn confronts him about his words, pointing out a possible conflict he must have with his own father, like most men do. Cinco denies it, and stays in denial even when the other members draw out a stark contrast between Cinco and his father, who are both public figures with a lot to clash. When the other members get up to go play conflict snakes and ladders, Cinco apologizes for possibly upsetting Lee. Lee begrudgingly accepts the apology and remarks he can't help but be overly confident. She tries to paint his observations as skewed, but Cinco defends that he's speaking his mind, asserting some things are just clear as day. On a particular day, Lee walks into the school building Edward lectures in, and finds the Cinco show holding on the ground floor, with Cinco in person as a guest speaker. He has a good number of engaged audience, standing and listening to him address the issues of spiked student fees in a serious, but somewhat fun manner. Lee meets Edward in class for a surprise visit. She brings along muffins and coffee and engages Edward in small talk about his work for the day. There isn't much input on her end when Edward gets on a roll, so they succumb to silently enjoying their coffees. Lee tries to leave without drawing Cinco's attention, but he calls her out, and she feigns surprise in seeing him. He points out he saw her earlier during the broadcast, and she admits she's there to see Edward, who she still lies as her second cousin. Cinco apologizes again for giving her a tough time and promises to be nicer. He claims he's having a blast in the sessions and learning a handful. Lee reveals her last days of the classes are behind her, because her manuscript, with a glaring deadline, is her priority. It's a bummer, but Cinco wishes her well, and notes to be more considerate on his next review of her new book. Later that evening, Edward stops by. He claims he's caught the spontaneous fever, and him and Lee should spend the night reviewing his students' papers. Lee lies her way out of it by stating she needs to be at the meeting he signed her up for. Edward, none the wiser, is glad to see her take the sessions seriously, and lets her be for the evening. Lee arrives just when the group are about to set out on a field trip. Cinco comments he's rather surprised to see Lee. She admits she recognized a brewing conflict back at home and came to the class to avoid it. This makes Cinco burst out in laughter. Their latest exercise is at the supermarket, and will happen in pairs. The winning pair gets a gift card to the Mangola restaurant, and the purpose of a prize is to make the exercise more competitive. Marilyn shares out colored balls to pair them, and cards with tasks written on. Lee was hoping to get paired with a group member named Carol, but ends up teamed up with Cinco. The goal is to create conflict by stalling the lines at the cashier. Cinco and Lee's card reads that one partner has to haggle the cashier for a dime, claiming they were shortchanged, while the other partner has to escalate the conflict by insisting they're in a hurry to leave. Lee chooses the former, and Cinco the latter. Camera, lights, action. Each team play their roles quite well. Lee even effortlessly pulls off a fake story about her late favorite uncle that made a dime too significant for her to be shortchanged. Her performance gets her several dimes from exasperated, waiting customers in the line. The class gathers after the exercise, and Marilyn announces Cinco and Lee as the winning team by 4 seconds. Maybe it's Lee trying to avoid tension from the other members, or her not wanting to dine with Cinco, but she hurriedly tries to give out her prize to Carol, who refuses it. Marilyn gives them a mental pat on the back for being able to confront conflict in a public space. Before they leave, Marilyn has another exercise that requires them staying in the same team. They are to confront the person they have the most conflict with, and have a proper interaction with them over unresolved triggers and issues. The exercise is due in a week's time. Cinco and Lee are momentarily left alone, and Cinco doesn't understand why Lee isn't excited about their prize won. She gives in, agreeing to lunch at the Mangola's restaurant. Cinco remarks that their lunch is one activity he now looks forward to. Lee is engaged with work when Edward comes unannounced. They share an awkward hug and a light kiss, and Edward mentions his reason for being there can't wait. He starts by addressing the recent strain in their relationship he believes resulted from their busy work schedules. To make up for their estranged time, he bought her a laptop, because he's aware her desktop has been a bit problematic for a while. Lee moves to kiss him, and this time it's less awkward. Edward mentions they'll have a lunch date setting, and in the meantime, he'll let her get busy with writing. That same afternoon happens to be Cinco and Lee's lunch outing. Lee calls Kate, expressing her discomfort to be there, with the big gesture Edward made earlier. Kate reassures her it's just an innocent lunch outing, not a date. Lee hesitates to concur. Cinco shows up and Lee tries to chicken out, lying about forgetting her gift card. Too bad for her, because Cinco's gift card covers the both of them. They're sat at a table, and Cinco begins his analysis disguised as small talk. He tells Lee she has a great personality, but it's a wonder why she's so unsure of herself. He calls her funny and pretty, and very much like himself. He establishes himself as a point-blank guy by announcing he's attracted to her. Lee pulls the reins on being told she's like him. Cinco reveals attributes that make them similar, including their unresolved father issues. Cinco admits he argues more with his father than they talk. Lee suggests confronting Dublin Sr. with a hug. Cinco scoffs at the idea, but invites her Saturday morning to witness what goes down. He asks her if there's anyone she'd like to try Marilyn's latest exercise on, like her father or Edward. She shuns the idea, and Cinco mentions how uncomfortable she gets at the mention of Edward. He questions if Edward is an actual person, and Lee gets apprehensive, remembering also real Edward is the reason she's in a sticky situation. Cinco mentions she strikes him as a person incapable of hurting people's feelings. Lee decides it's time to politely walk away from the lunch. Lee tries to go full throttle on her manuscript, but can't seem to concentrate. She decides to tune into the radio show, and finds herself listening to Cinco recount their lunch outing that was almost a date. The topic of discussion becomes dance of the sexes. Lee impulsively dials the hotline and introduces herself with the same fake name from the last call. Cinco points out she sounds familiar, but if he knows it's actually Lee speaking, he fails to mention it, yet. Lee, on air, calls him admirable, but so direct that it could make some people uncomfortable. He lets her rant before trying to clarify it's indeed Lee on air. He encourages her to speak her mind directly to him. But she ends the call without another word. Another unsuccessful day with her manuscript and laptop. A knock wakes Lee from her pile of scattered work. She groggily makes her way to the door and finds an upbeat Cinco. He reminds her it's Saturday morning, and they have an assignment to do. Cinco is his annoying and playful self throughout the walk to their destination, pulling her leg at one moment about having her as a regular on his show based on audience demand. Lee notices how restless and uneasy Cinco is for the first time, as they wait to see his father. The father acknowledges them with mild sarcasm, and Cinco wordlessly insists Lee will be accompanying him through the hailstorm by pulling her along. The three converge at Dublin Sr.'s office, and the silence promises to brew for much longer, until Lee breaks it by introducing herself. Dublin Sr. apologizes to Lee for the tension, mentioning it's weird to have his son visiting. Apparently, he never does visit. The last time they talked, a quarrel sparked, with Cinco accusing his father of sabotaging his radio show. Dublin Sr. remembers it as a mere debate his son couldn't handle. Regardless, Dublin Sr. mentions he has a flight to Boston to catch, and doesn't have much time for chit-chat. Cinco reveals that's why he's actually there. He wants to just chat. Dublin Sr. remarks just talking isn't their thing. Cinco concedes and is ready to leave, but ultimately Lee gives him the mental push to do what he needs to do. Cinco moves forward and gives his puzzled dad a long hug. He tells his father he loves him, and thanks him for challenging him into being a better man. Dublin Sr. is moved to give Cinco a second and more emotional hug, telling him with a kiss that he loves Cinco, too. When they leave, Cinco acknowledges Lee for being the push he needed. Lee tries to diminish her role, but Cinco points out the hug was the deal breaker, and mentions Lee has a unique perspective to dealing with conflict that he admires. Cinco suggests they're both pumped up to confront conflict on Lee's side. Just then, her phone rings, and it's Edward. She forgot their lunch date for Saturday noon. Just before she has to leave, Cinco gives her a hug and thanks her for helping him out. Lee, not wanting to disappoint him any further, meets Edward at the restaurant in her sweats and joggers. The restaurant happens to be the same restaurant she and Cinco visited earlier. The waiter recognizes her and welcomes her back, but thank goodness, Edward isn't any wiser. Lee notices Edward has spontaneity fever, with the whole trying out a new restaurant and wanting to try out a new meal. Lee nervously asks what the occasion is about, and next thing she knows, her parents are strumming in, and Edward is on one knee with a ring in his hand. The gesture catches the attention of other diners. So many eyes and ears waiting for her answer. She eventually succumbs and gives the answer expected, yes. The waiters join tables so Lee's parents can join in on the private celebration. Senator Douglas remarks Edward is the perfect suitor, and Lee's mom is pumped about planning the wedding. The pressure mounts when Edward announces their wedding will be in 3 weeks, to honor his sick grandma, who shares the same birthday as their future wedding date. Wedding plans begin, amidst Lee still trying to tidy up her manuscripts and her still ongoing conflict management classes. Marilyn's latest exercise is tackling embarrassing conflicts with grace and dignity. Cinco notices Lee looks detached, but she assures she's up for the task. They get to the mall, and Lee is supposed to return a pair of trousers she says are too expensive. Marilyn monitors the interaction and has to interfere when she sees Lee veering off the graceful approach. Lee apologizes and unravels what has her so agitated by showing off her engagement ring. Like cup filled to the brim, she spills about her pending marriage to a boyfriend she doesn't love, because she's gone overboard with avoiding conflict and being a people pleaser. Now Cinco knows who Edward is, and he curiously asks if Lee actually plans to marry him. She huffs in response and leaves. Lee's mom visits a dejected Lee at home, and her motherly intuition has her addressing the obvious elephant in the room. She narrates how she faced a similar situation when she was younger, but she chose to follow her heart and follow the man she actually loved. It's a decision she's yet to regret, and she advises Lee to do the same before it's too late. She also mentions she tends to do things her husband's way out of love and choice. Lee returns back to class and decides this time she's not going to be inaccessible. She admits she desperately was in need of the class the whole time. She's facing going through with the wedding because she can't fathom hurting Edward's feelings, embarrassing her dad, or even disappointing her publisher. Marilyn encourages her effort and pushes for yet another exercise that will strengthen her newfound stance. The exercise is an imaginary confrontation, and Cinco offers to be the Edward Lee will have to confront. The exercise starts off well, and Lee is able to admit she can't marry Edward because they're not compatible. Cinco uses the opportunity to unravel more by asking who Lee feels would be a compatible match. Lee holds Cinco's gaze as she reveals her ideal match as someone willing to pay attention to who she is. The rest of the class fades into the background. They become spectators of Cinco and Lee expressing their feelings for one another. Cinco has hurt Lee kept up the lie even after the field trip, as he believed that was a time he was most transparent with someone who couldn't do the same. Marilyn steps in, as she believes Lee's final task is to decide and confront whomever she has the most conflict with. While Marilyn thinks it could either be her father or Edward, Cinco is more assured Lee's biggest target is herself. He ushers her in front of a mirror and walks out of the class, leaving Lee to battle with her tears. Lee goes home and spends the rest of the night working on her story. Before she knows it, she's on a marathon, typing away. The next time she has a session, Cinco is absent, and Lee goes looking for him at his workstation. She thanks him for being her catalyst in a chemical reaction she didn't know she needed, and announces she's finished her book. Cinco acknowledges the milestone and reminds her the next is her wedding. She's able to admit her true feelings for Cinco, and Cinco inquires if she's called things off with Edward. Lee finds herself faltering, bringing up excuses about her and Cinco barely knowing themselves. Cinco makes it straight he won't be a party to her indecisive schemes. He won't be her rebound. Lee mans up and pays Edward a last surprising visit. Afterwards is a meeting with her publisher, who informs her the promotional team was not pleased with her revised manuscript. Lee faces being dropped by the publishing company, but she stands her ground about keeping true to her own voice in writing. She asks for JR's personal opinion on the book, and JR can say for sure the manuscript was a breath of fresh air. Just as she's about to walk away from her publishing deal, JR decides to take the risk and pull some strings. It's the last day of class, and every member has experienced development in one way or another. Robert and Glenda have reconciled, Eric got a promotion, Carol speaks more audibly and signed up for singing lessons. Lee's book is to be released the following month and is specifically dedicated to Marilyn and her classmates, and Cinco decided to skip class. Kate informs Lee about her progress on the newspaper's weekly list of bestsellers. She has the Dublin show tuned in as usual, but offers to turn it off if it makes Lee uncomfortable. Lee declines. She's already caught wind of the basics anyway. The particular episode tuned in has Dublin Sr. as a guest star, showcasing an improved father and son relationship. During Lee's book signing, she notices Cinco silently pick up a copy and exit the scene. The next time they'll meet is at a party still centered around her book. Cinco read her book and appreciates it enough to come for her autograph. His favorite part is the ending where the main character doesn't marry the guy, leaving room to pursue her true love. Cinco feels they can discuss the details of the sequel over lunch, and Lee is just about to voice her stance when Senator Douglas spots Cinco. Lee, who is no longer a doormat, confidently introduces Cinco as her new love interest. She expresses her wish to have her father's approval concerning the relationship, but Senator Douglas is amused that Lee feels she needs his permission in the first place. He clarifies he just wants his daughter to be happy and is willing to get along with the man she chooses. The time for toasts arrives, and Senator Douglas gives a short, sweet speech celebrating his daughter. Cinco asks for permission to say something, and he's granted the stage. He uses the podium to ask Lee to be his girlfriend, and she agrees, sealing their ordeal with a kiss and then a dance.